Chapter 6 of Miss Santa Claus of the Pullman by Annie Fellows Johnston. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. Christmas morning when Willam awoke, he was as bewildered as if he had opened his eyes in a new world. He was in a little white bed, such as he had never seen before, and the blankets were blue, with a border of white bunnies around each one. Between him and the rest of the room was a folding screen like a giant picture book cover, showing everybody in Mother Goose's whole family. He lay staring at it a while, and when he recognized Tommy Tucker and Simple Simon and Mother Hubbard's dog, he didn't feel quite so lost and strange as he did at first. Always at the Junction he had to lie still until Uncle Neal made the fire and the room was warm. But here it was already warm, and he could hear steam hissing somewhere. It seemed to be coming from the gilt pipes under the window. Wondering what was on the other side of the screen, he slid out from under the bunny blankets and peeped cautiously around the wall of Mother Goose pictures. It was Libby on the other side, in another little white bed just like his. With one spring he pounced up on top of it and squirmed in beside her. The first moment of Libby's awakening was as bewildering as Willam's had been. Then she began to have a confused recollection of the night before. She remembered being lifted from the pillow on the car seat and hugged and kissed, and having her limp, sleepy arms thrust into elusive coat sleeves. Somebody held her hand and hurried her down the aisle after her father, who was carrying Willam, because he was so sound asleep that they couldn't even put his overcoat on him. It was just wrapped around him. Then she remembered jolting across the city in an omnibus, with her head on a muff in a lady's lap, and of leaning against that same lady afterwards, while her clothes were being unbuttoned and her eyelids kept falling shut. She had never been so sleepy in her whole life that she could remember. Suddenly she sat straight up in bed and stared at something hanging on the post of the low footboard. A Christmas stocking, all red and silver, and for her. Even from where she was, she could read the name that Miss Santa Claus had printed in big letters on the scrap of paper pinned to it. Libby. Only those who have thrilled with that same speechless rapture can know the tithe of the bliss which filled Libby's soul as she seized it, her first Christmas stocking, and began to explore it with fingers trembling in their eagerness. When down in the very toe she found the little shiny gold ring like Maudie Peters's, all she had breath for was a long indrawn of ecstasy. "Oh, Willam!" she exclaimed when she could find speech. "Aren't you glad we believed? But I aren't got any stocking," he said gloomily, eyeing her enviously while she slipped the ring on her finger and waved her hand around to admire the effect. "But you got all you asked for, the ride on the cars," she reminded him cheerfully. "Did you look on your post to see if there was anything?" No, he had not looked, and at the suggestion he sprang out of Libby's bed like a furry white kitten in his little teasel-down night drawers made with feet to them, and knelt on top of his own bunny blankets. "Oh, Libby, there is one, there is!" he cried excitedly. "It slipped around to the back of the post where I couldn't see it before. Look, an orange and a lantern just like yours, and what's this? Oh, look!" The awesome joy of his voice made Libby join him on the other side of the Mother Goose screen, and she snatched the little punch from him almost as eagerly as he had snatched it from the stocking, to try it on the slip of paper which bore the name Willam pinned across the toe. They had watched the conductor using his the previous day, and had each wished for one to use in playing their favorite game. Clip, it went, and their heads bumped together in their eagerness to see the result. There in the paper was a clear-cut hole in the shape of a tiny star, and on the blanket where it had fallen from the hole was the star itself. The punch which the conductor had used made round holes. This was 1,000 times nicer. Up till this moment, in the bewilderment of finding themselves in their new surroundings, the children had forgotten all about Miss Santa Claus and her story of Ina and the swans. But now Libby looked up as Willam snatched back the punch and began clipping holes in the paper as fast as he could clip. The shower of stars falling on the blanket made her think of the star-flower charm, which they had been advised to begin using first thing in the morning. Immediately Libby retired to her side of the screen and began to dress. "Don't you know," she reminded Willam, "she said that we must be particular to start right. It's like hooking up a dress. If you start crooked, everything will keep on being crooked all the way down. I'm going to get started right, for I've found it's just as easy to be good as it is to be bad when you once get used to trying." Willam wasn't paying attention. He had punched the slip of paper so full of holes it wouldn't hold another one, and now he tried the punch on the edge of one of the soft blankets, just to see if it would make a blue star drop out. But the punch didn't cut blankets as evenly as it did paper. Only a snip of wool came loose and stuck in the punch, and the hole almost closed up afterwards when he picked at it a little. He didn't show it to Libby. That is the last he thought of the charm that day, for their father put his head in at the door to call a Merry Christmas, and say that he'd be in a few minutes to help him into his clothes, and that their mother would come too to tie Libby's hair ribbons and hurry things along, because they must hustle down to breakfast to see the grand surprise she had for them. Then Willam hurried so fast that he was in his clothes by the time his father came in. He had even washed his own face and hands after a fashion, and there was nothing to be done for him but to brush his hair. And while his father was doing that, he talked and joked in such an entertaining way that Willam did not feel at all strange with him as he had expected to. But he felt strange when presently his father exclaimed, "Here's Mother," and somebody put her arms around him and kissed him and wished him a Merry Christmas. And then she did the same to Libby. She looked so smiling and homelike that she seemed more like Miss Sally Watts or somebody they had known at the Junction than a stepmother. If Willam hadn't known that she was one, and that he was expected to love her, he would have liked her right away, almost as much as he did Miss Sally. But he felt shy and uncomfortable, and he didn't know what to call her. The name Mamma didn't belong to her. It never could. That belonged to the beautiful picture hanging on the wall where it could be seen from both little beds, last thing at night and first thing in the morning. They had had a smaller picture just like it at the Junction, but this was more beautiful because it showed the soft pink in her cheeks and the blue in her smiling eyes, and the other was only a photograph. Willam knew as well as Libby did that the reason their father had kept talking about "your mother" all the time he was brushing his hair was because he wanted them to call her that. But he couldn't. He didn't know her well enough. He felt that it would choke him to call her anything but she or her. While his father carried him down to breakfast pick-a-back, she led Libby by the hand and told about finding the stockings pinned to the car seats, and about a beautiful girl who suddenly appeared beside her in the aisle, and asked her to be sure to hang them where the children could find them first thing in the morning. Santa Claus had asked her to be sure that they got them. She had on a long red coat and a little fur cap with a red feather in it. There wasn't any time to ask her questions, for while they were trying to waken the children and hurry them off the train, which stopped such a few minutes, she just smiled and vanished. Libby and Willam looked at each other and said in the same breath, "Miss Santa Claus." Libby would have gone on to explain who she was, but they had reached the dining room door, and there, in the center of the breakfast table, stood a Christmas tree, tipped with shining tapers, and every branch abloom with the wonderful fruitage of Yuletide. It was the first one they had ever seen, all lighted and glistening, so it was no wonder that its glories drove everything else out of their thoughts. There was a tricycle for Willam waiting beside his chair, with a card on it that said, "With love from Father and Mother," and in Libby's chair, with the same kind of a card, was a doll, with not only real hair, but real eyelashes, and a trunk full of the most beautiful clothes that she had made. As it was a holiday, their father could give his entire time to making them forget that they were miles and miles from Grandma Neal and the Junction. So what with the snow fort in the yard, and a big Christmas dinner, and a long sleigh ride afterward, they were whirled from one exciting thing to another, till nightfall. Even then there was no time to grow lonely, for their father sat in the firelight, a child on each knee, holding them close, while she played on the piano, soft sweet lullabies, so alluring that the Sandman himself had to steal out to listen. It was different next morning when their father had to go back to the office, but the hooking up started out all right for Libby. She remembered it while she was washing her hands, and saw the gleam of the little new ring on her finger. So her first shy question, when they were left alone with her, was, "Don't you want me to do something?" The desire to please was so evident that the answer was accompanied by a quick hug which held her close for a moment. "Yes, dear, if you can just play with your little brother and keep him contented a while, it will be more help than anything." Libby skipped promptly away to do her bidding. She knew that Willam would want to go thundering up and down the back hall in his tricycle, playing train with the lantern and the punch. She would far rather devote her time to the new doll, for she hadn't yet tried on half its wardrobe. But Miss Santa Claus's words came back to her very clearly. "It will be like picking a little white flower whose name is Obedience." Feeling that she was following in the footsteps of the Princess Ina, she threw herself into the game of railroad train until Willam found it more thrilling than it had ever been before. Later in the morning they trundled the tricycle out into the back yard to ride up and down the long brick pavement which led to the alley gate. The snow had been swept off and the bricks were dry and clean. They took turns riding. The tricycle was the engine, and the one whose turn it was to go on foot ran along behind, personating the train. They had been at the sport some time when they suddenly became aware that someone was watching them. A small boy with curious bulging eyes and a mouth shaped like a round O was peeking in at them between the pickets of the alley gate. He was a boy 2 years bigger and older than Willam, but he was unkempt looking, and his stockings wrinkled down over his shoe tops, and there was a ring of molasses or jam or something around his mouth. Their discovery dampened their zest in the game somewhat. It made Willam, who had never played with anyone but Libby, a trifle self-conscious. He stopped letting off steam with his lips, and wheeling around, trundled back to the house in silence. Libby, too, was disconcerted. Her car wheels failed her. She trailed back in his wake, a little girl instead of a noisy train. Yet the discovery did not stop the game altogether. At the kitchen steps they turned as they had been doing all along, and bravely started towards the alley again. This time the gate opened and the dirty little boy came in. It was Benjy, known to all the neighborhood, if not to them, for he wandered around it like a stray cat. Whenever he saw a door ajar, he entered, and stayed until something attracted his attention elsewhere. He went home only when he was sent for. If nothing of interest pulled him the other way, he went unresistingly. If not, he was dragged. Wherever he happened to be at mealtime, he stayed, whether he was invited or not. There was something almost spooky in Benjy's sudden appearances and in his all-devouring curiosity. It wasn't the childish, normal kind that asks questions. It was the gaping, uncanny kind that silently peers over into your open pocketbook or stands looking into your mouth while you talk. Older people disliked him because he would leave his play to stand in front of them and gape and listen. And he was always grubby and unbuttoned. Although he was 6 years old, it was no concern of his that his stockings were always turned down over his shoe tops. If the public preferred to see them smooth, then the public must attend to his garter snaps. The tricycle, having reached the end of the walk, came to a halt. Benjy opened the gate, walked in, and took possession. It was from no sense of fear that Willam climbed down and let Benjy assume control. It was simply that a new force had come into his life, a strangely fascinating one. He had never had anything to do with boys before, and this one, bigger than himself, dominated him from the start. He found it much more thrilling to follow his lead than his sister's. After a few futile attempts to keep on with the game, Libby fell out of it. Not that Benjy objected to her. He simply ignored her, and Willam took his cue from him. So she sat on the kitchen steps and watched them, till she felt cold and went into the house. The coming of Benjy left Libby free to turn to her own affairs, but somehow she could not do it with quite the same zest, feeling that she had been shouldered out of Willam's game by an interloper. She thoroughly disapproved of Benjy from the first glance. He was a trial to her orderly little soul, and his lack of neatness added to her resentment at being ignored. When Willam was called in out of the cold later in the afternoon, Benjy followed as a matter of course. Several times she fell upon him and yanked him into shape with masterful touches which left him as neatly geared together as Willam always was. But by the time he had squirmed out of her hands, his garter snaps were out of a job again, and his waist and little trousers were parting company at the belt. All that day he stayed on, till he was dragged home at dusk like a lump of dough. He didn't resist when the maid came for him. He simply relaxed and left all the exertion of getting home entirely to her. When the door closed behind him, Libby drew a long breath of relief, as if she had been 27 instead of just 7. He hadn't done anything, but his wild suggestions had kept Willam on the verge of doing things all day. He was in the act of prying the seat off his new tricycle by Benjy's orders when she went in and stopped him. And she went into the nursery just in time to keep him from doing some unheard-of thing to the radiator, so that it would blow off steam like a real engine. Willam had always been such a sensible child, with a conscience of his own about injuring things, that she couldn't understand why all of a sudden he should be possessed to do 100 things that he ought not to do. It was a relief to find that the spell lifted with Benjy's removal. He came and cuddled down beside her in the big armchair before the fire, waiting for supper time to come, and somehow she felt that she had her own little brother again. He had seemed like a stranger all day, but her exile from his company had not been without its compensations. "I can play 3 blind mice. See how they run," she told him as they rocked back and forth. "She taught me. She came in while I was touching the keys just as easy, so that they hardly made a sound, and asked me did I want to learn to play on them. And I said, oh yes, more than anything in the world. And she said, That was exactly the way she used to feel when she was a little girl like me living at the Junction. She wore her hair in little braids like mine and tiptoed around like a little mouse when she was in strange places, and sometimes when she looked at me, she could almost believe it was her own little self come back again. Then she showed me how to make my fingers run down the keys just like the three mice did. She's going to teach me more every day till I can play it for Father some night. But you must cross your heart and body not to tell, 'cause I want to surprise him." Willam crossed as directed, and stood by much impressed when Libby climbed up on the piano stool and played the 7 notes which she had learned over and over. "Three blind mice, see how they run." "Tomorrow she's going to show me as far as 'They all took after the farmer's wife.' I wish it was tomorrow right now." She gave an eager little wiggle that sent her slipping off the stool. "Oh, I like it here now," she exclaimed, reseating herself and beginning an untiring reiteration of the 7 notes. "So do I, some," answered Willam. "I like it kind of bingy, but I don't like to hear so much blind mice. You make 'em run too long." Libby felt vaguely aggrieved by his criticism, but her pleasure in her own performance was something too great to forego. Next morning, while they were dressing, the door opened silently and Benjy appeared on Willam's side of the screen. He came so noiselessly that it gave Libby a start when later on she was made aware of his presence. His host, equally wordless, was struggling with a little union suit of woolen underwear. He was wordless because he was so busily occupied trying to get into it, and the unexpected entrance made him still more anxious to cover himself. Grandma Neal had always helped him with it, but he had valiantly fought off all offers to help since coming to his new home. This morning, slightly bothered by the presence of his self-invited guest, he got it so twisted that no matter how he turned it, one leg and one sleeve were always wrong side out. Benjy watched with his curious bulging eyes, and his mouth making a round open O was of no more help than one of those heathen idols who having eyes see not, and having hands handle not. But he finally made a suggestion. He was eager to begin playing. "Ah, leave 'em go. Don't try to put 'em on." It was this unexpected remark in a voice not her brother's which made Libby drop her button-hook on the other side of the screen. "But it'll be cold," objected Willam, staring at the strip of wintry landscape which showed through his window. "Naw, you won't," was the confident answer. "Your outside clothes are thick." "But I never have left them off," said Willam, ready to cry over the exasperating tangle of legs and sleeves. Libby, all dressed but buttoning her shoes, heard Willam being thus tempted of the evil one, and peeping around the giant picture book cover, discovered him standing in nothing but his tiny knee breeches, preparing to slip his Russian blouse of blue serge over his bare back. "Why, Willam Branfield, stop this minute and put on your underclothes," she demanded. Then, growing desperate as her repeated commands were not obeyed, she called threateningly, "If you don't put them on this minute, I'll tell on you." "Huh? Who'll you tell?" jeered Benjy. "Mr. Bramfield's down cellar talking to the furnace man, and Willam doesn't have to mind her. She ain't his mother." The question gave Libby pause. Not that it left her undecided about telling, but it reminded her that she had no title to give her when she called for help. It was like trying to open a door that had no knob, to call into space without having any handle of a name to take hold on first. There was no time to lose. Willam was buttoning himself up in his blouse. Libby hurried to the top of the stairs and called, "Say!" There was no answer, so she called again, "Say!" Then at the top of her voice, "Say! Willam's leaving off his flannels. Please come and make him behave." The next instant her heart began to beat violently, and she waited in terror to see what was going to happen. She wished passionately that she had not told. Suppose she had brought down some cruel punishment on her little brother? Her first impulse had been to array herself on the side of law and order, but her second was to spread her wings like an old hen in defense of its only chick. When she came into the room, Willam was backing up defiantly against the wall. She looked so pleasant and smiling as she bent over him in her pretty morning gown, that it took the courage out of him. If she had been cross, he could have fought her. But she just stood there looking so big and capable and calm, taking it for granted that he would put on his flannels as soon as she had untwisted the funny knot they were in, that there wasn't anything to do but obey. Willam was a reasonable child, and if they had been alone, that would have been the last of the matter. But he resented being made to mind before his company, and he resented her saying to him, "Better run on home, Benjy." She might as well have told an oyster to run on home. He gave no sign of having heard her, and when the children went down to breakfast, he calmly went with them. He had had his, and would not sit down, but stood leaning against the table, pushing the cloth awry, watching every mouthful everybody swallowed, until Libby saw her father make a queer face. He said something to her in long syllabled words, so long that only grown people could understand, and she laughed and answered that even disagreeable things might prove to be blessings in disguise if they helped others to take root in strange places. Benjy was dragged home again before lunch, but returned immediately after, still chewing, and bearing traces of it on both face and fingers. In the interval of his absence, Miss Bramfell, as he called her, had occasion to go upstairs. On a certain step of the stairway, when her eyes were on a level with the nursery floor, she saw through its open door something white stuffed away back under the bureau on Willam's side of the room. Wondering what it could be, she went in and poked it out with a cane which the boys had been playing with. To her astonishment, the bundle proved to be Willam's little white union suit. Again Libby waited with beating heart and clasped hands while he was called in and buttoned firmly into it. She forbade him sternly not to take it off again until bedtime, but nothing else happened, and Libby breathed freely once more. Grandma Neal would have spanked him, she thought. Willam needed spanking now and then, if one could only be sure that it wouldn't be done too hard. Mr. Branfield did not come home till late that night. He was called out of town on business. As soon as the telephone message came, she gave the cook a holiday, and told Libby she was going to get supper herself. Libby could choose whatever she and Willam liked best, and they'd surprise him with it after Benjy had been dragged home. So Libby chose, and was left to keep house while she hurried down to the only place in town where she was sure of getting what Libby had chosen, and carried it home herself, and cooked it just as they used to cook them at the Junction when she was a little girl and lived there years ago. And Libby had the best time helping. As she followed her about the kitchen, she thought of the things she intended to tell Maudie Peters the first time they went back to the Junction to visit. She and Libby talked a great deal about their prospective visit, for she had made playhouses under the same old thorn trees by the brook where Libby's last one was, and she had coasted down Clifford Hill many a time, and she had even sat in the third seat from the front in the row next to the western wall one whole term of school. That was Libby's own seat. No wonder she knew just how Libby felt about everything when she could remember so many experiences that were like this little girl's, who followed her back and forth from table to stove, bringing up all her own childhood before her. Willam sniffed expectantly as he climbed up to the supper table. A delicious and a beloved odor had reached him. He smiled like a full moon when his plate was put in front of him and his spoon went hurriedly up to his mouth. "Oh, rabbit dravy!" he sighed ecstatically. She had gone back to the kitchen for something else, and Libby took occasion to say reprovingly, "Yes, and she went a long, long way to get that rabbit, just because I told her you love 'em so, and she cooked it herself and burned her hand a doing it. She was gathering a starflower for you, even if you have been bad and forgot what Miss Santa Claus told you." When she came back with the rest of the supper, Willam stole a glance at her hands. Sure enough, one was bound up in a handkerchief. It had not been blistered by nettles, but it had been blistered for him. Hastily swallowing what was in his spoon, he slid down from the table. "Why, what's the matter, dear?" she asked in surprise. "Don't you like it after all?" He cast one furtive, abashed look at her as he sidled towards the door. There was confession in that look, and penitence, and a sturdy resolve to make what atonement he could. Then from the hall he called back the rather enigmatical answer, "I haven't got 'em on, but I'm going to put 'em on." And the rabbit Dravy waited until he clattered up the stairs to wiggle out of his suit and into the flannels which Benjy's jeers had made him discard just before supper for the third time that day. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Miss Santa Claus of the Pullman by Annie Fellows Johnston. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. In the story it was 6 long years before the Princess Ina completed her task, but less than a week went by before Libby was convinced that the charm was a potent one, and that Miss Santa Claus had spoken truly. But there was one thing she could not understand. In the story one found the star flowers only among nettles and briars, and gathered them to the accompaniment of scratches and stings. Yet she was finding it not only a pleasure to obey this new authority, but a tingling happiness to do anything for her which would call forth some smile of approval or a caress. Still, she saw that the story way was the true way in Willam's case, for so many things that he was told to do made him feel all cross and scratchy and hot. They interfered with his play, or clashed with the ideas he imbibed from Benjy. Some of Benjy's ideas were as catching and distorting as the mumps. The conductor's punch did not long continue to be the daily reminder to Willam that Libby's ring was to her, for it mysteriously disappeared one day and was lost for months. It disappeared the very day that a row of little star-shaped holes was found along the edge of the expensive Holland window shade in the front window of the parlor. Benjy had suggested punching them. He wanted a lot of little stars to paste all over their shoes. Why he wanted them, nobody but he could understand. But the punch served its purpose, for the Holland shade was not taken down on account of the holes, and whenever the row of little stars met Molly Branfield's eyes, they reminded her of the day when Libby threw herself into her arms, calling her mother for the first time, and sobbing out the story of Ina and the swans. Distressed by Willam's wickedness, Libby begged her not to stop loving him, even if he did keep on being naughty, and to try the charm on him which would change him into a real little son. Many a time in the months which followed, the row of little holes brought a smile of tolerant tenderness when she was puzzling over ways to deal with the stubbornness of the small boy who resented her authority. She knew that it was not because he was bad that he resented it, but because, as Libby suggested, he had started out wrong in his hooking up. Many a time Libby was moved to say mournfully, "Oh, if he'd just remember what Miss Santa Claus told him, this never would have happened." It was not every day, however, that this crookedness was apparent. Often from daylight till dark he went happily from one thing to another without a single incident to mar the peacefulness of the hours. He liked the new home with its banisters to slide down, and its many windows looking out on streets where something interesting was always happening. He liked to water the flowers in the dining room windows. It made him feel that he was helping make a spot of summertime in the world when all out of doors was white with snow. One of the pots of flowers was his, a rose geranium. Even before the wee buds began to swell, it was a thing of joy, for he had only to rub his fingers over a leaf to make it send forth a smell so good that one longed to eat it. He liked the race down the hall every evening trying to beat Libby to the door to open it for their father. Now that he was acquainted with him again, it seemed the very nicest thing in the world to have a big jolly father who could swing him up on his shoulders and play circus tricks with him just like an acrobat, and who knew fully as much as the President of the United States. And Willam liked the time which often came before that race down the hall, the wait in the firelight while she played on the piano and he and Libby sang with her. There was one song about the farmer feeding his flocks, with a quack quack here and a gobble gobble there, that he liked especially. Whenever they came to the chorus of the flocks and the herds, it was such fun to make all the barnyard noises. Sometimes, with their lusty mooing and lowing, the noise would be so great that they would fail to hear the latchkey turn in the door, and first thing they knew, there their father would be in the room mooing with them, in a deep voice that thrilled them like a bass drum. Libby entered school after the holidays, and Benjy started back on his second half year, but he did not go regularly. Many a day when he should have been in his classes, he was playing war in the Branfield attic or circus in the nursery. It was always on those days that the crookedness of Willam was more manifest, and for that reason a great effort was made periodically to get rid of Benjy. But it seemed a hopeless task. He might be set boldly out of doors and told to go home, but even locks and bolts could not keep him out. He oozed in again somewhere, just like smoke. Repeated telephone messages to his mother had no effect. She seemed as indifferent to his being a nuisance to the neighbors as he was to his garter snaps being unfastened. Several times, thinking to escape him, when he had announced his intentions the night before of coming early, Mrs. Branfield took William downtown with her shopping. But he trailed them around the streets just like a little dog till he found them, and attached himself as joyously as if they had whistled to him. And he looked even worse than an unwashed, uncombed little terrier, for he was always unbuttoned and ungartered besides. Upon these appearances, Willam, who a moment before had been the most interested and interesting of companions, pointed at the shop windows and asked questions in a high, happy little voice, would pull loose from his companion's hand and fall back beside Benjy. The worst of it was that the unwelcome visitor rarely did anything that could be pointed out to Willam as an offense. It was simply that his presence had a subtle, moving quality like yeast, which started fermentation in the Branfield household whenever he dropped into it. Fortunately, when summer came, Benjy's mother departed to the seashore, taking him with her, and Willam made the acquaintance of the children on the next block. There were several boys his own size who swarmed in the Branfield yard continually. He had a tent for one thing, which was an unusual attraction, and a slide. Up to a reasonable point he had access to a cooky jar and an apple barrel. Often little tarts found their way to the tent on mornings when "the gang" proposed playing elsewhere, and often the long hot afternoons were livened with pitchers of lemonade in which ice clinked invitingly, a nice big chunk apiece, which lasted till the lemonade was gone and could be used afterward in a sort of game. You dropped them on the ground to see who could pick his up and hold it the longest with his bare toes. Willam had a birthday about this time, with 5 candles on his cake, and 5 boys, besides Libby, to share the feast. He loved all these things. He was proud of having treats to offer the boys, which they could not find in any other yard on that street, and in time he began to love the hand which dealt them out. He might have done so sooner if Libby had not been so aggravating about it. She always took occasion to tell him afterward that such kindnesses were the little golden star flowers Mother was gathering for him, and that he ought to be ashamed to do even the littlest thing she told him not to, when she was so good to him. Unfortunately, Libby had overheard her mother speak of her as a real little comfort in the way she tried to uphold her authority and help her manage Willam. The remark made her doubly zealous, and her efforts, in consequence, doubly offensive to Willam. He was learning early that a saint is one of the most exasperating people in the world to live with. Even when they don't say anything, they can make you feel the contrast sometimes so strongly that you want to be bad on purpose, just because they are the way they are. Libby's little ring still turned her waking thoughts in the direction of Ina and the swans, and her morning remarks usually pointed the same way. The cherry red stocking with its tinsel fringe hung from the side of her mirror, the most cherished ornament in the room, and a daily reminder of Miss Santa Claus, who was forever enshrined in her little heart as one of the dearest memories of her life. She felt that she owed everything to Miss Santa Claus. But for her, she might have started out crooked, and might never have found her way to the mother love which had grown to be such a precious thing to her that she could not bear for Willam not to share it fully with her. He learned to fight that summer, and nothing made him quite so furious as to have Libby interfere when he had some boy down. And by sheer force of will, it seemed, since her 3 years' advantage in age gave her little in strength, pull him off his adversary, flapping and scratching like a little gamecock. Sometimes it made him so angry that he wanted to tear her to pieces. The worst of it was that she always took Libby's part on such occasions, and never seemed to understand that it was necessary for him to do these things. She always looked so sorry and worried when he was dragged into the house, roaring and resentful. Gradually, as summer wore on into the autumn, it began to make him feel uncomfortable when he saw that sorry, worried look. It hurt him worse than when she sent him to his room or tied him to the table leg for punishment. And one night when he had openly defied her and been impudent, she did not say anything, but she did not kiss him good night as usual. That hurt him worst of all. He lay awake a long time thinking about it. Part of the time he was crying softly, but he had his face snuggled close down in the pillow so that Libby couldn't hear him. He wished with all his heart that she was his own real mother. He felt that he needed one. He needed one who could understand, and who had a right to punish him. It was because she hadn't that right that he resented her authority. All the boys said she hadn't. If she did no more than call from the window, "Don't do that, Willam," they'd say in an undertone, "You don't have to pay attention to her." They seemed to think it was all right for their mothers to slap them and scold them and cuff them on the ears. He'd seen it done. He wouldn't care how much he was slapped and cuffed, if only someone who was his truly own did it. Somebody who loved him. A queer little feeling had been creeping up in his heart for some time. Very often when she spoke to Libby, she called her little daughter, and she and Libby seemed to belong to each other in a way that shut Willam out and gave him a lonesome, left in the cold feeling. Willam was a reasonable child, and he was just, and up there in the dark, where he could be honest with himself, he had to acknowledge that it was his own fault that she hadn't kissed him good night. It was his fault because, having started out crooked, he didn't seem to be able to do anything but to go on crooked to the end. He couldn't tell her, but he wished, oh, how he wished that she could know how he felt, and know that he was crying up there in the dark about it. He wished he could go back to the Junction and be Grandma Neal's little boy. She always kissed him good night, even on days when she had to switch him with a peach tree switch. When he was a little bigger, he would just run off and go back to Grandma Neal. But next morning he was glad that he was not living at the Junction, for he started to kindergarten, and a world of new interests opened up before him. Benjy came back to town that week, but he did not find quite the same tractable follower. Willam had learned how to play with other boys and how to make other boys do his bidding, so he did not always allow Benjy to dictate. Still, the leaven of an uneasy presence began working again, and worked on till it was suddenly counteracted by the coming of another Christmas season. Both Libby and Willam began to feel its approach when it was still a month off. They felt it in the mysterious thrills that began to stir the household, as sap raising in a tree thrills it with stirrings of spring. There were secrets and whisperings. There were counting of pennies and planning for ways to earn more, for they were wiser about Christmas this year. They knew that there were 3 kinds of presents. There is the kind that Santa Claus puts into your stockings, just because he is Santa Claus, and the Sky Road leads from his kingdom of giving straight to the kingdom of little hearts who love and believe in him. Then there's the kind that you give to the people you love, just because you love them, and you put your name on those. And third, there's the kind that you give secretly in the name of Santa Claus, just to help him out if he is extra busy and should happen to send you word that he needs your services. Libby and Willam received no such messages, being so small, but their father had one. He sent a load of coal and some rent money to a man who had lost a month's wages on account of sickness in his family. And it must have been a very happy and delightful feeling that Santa Claus gave their father for doing it, for his voice sounded that way afterward when he said, "After all, Molly, that's the best kind of giving. We ought to do more of it and less of the other." When it came to the first kind of presents, neither Libby nor Willam made a choice. They sent their names and addresses up the chimney, so that the reindeer might be guided to the right rooftop, and left the rest to the generosity of the reindeer's wise master to surprise them as he saw fit. They were almost sure that the things they daily expressed a wish for would come by the way of the Christmas tree, as the doll and the tricycle had the year before, with the love of father and mother. But when it came to the second kind of presents, they had much to consider. They wanted to give to the family and each other, and the cook and their teachers and the children they played with most, and 6 people at the Junction. The visit which they had planned all year was to be a certainty now. The day after Christmas, the entire family was to go for a week's visit to Grandma and Uncle Neal. That last week the children went around the house in one continual thrill of anticipation. Such delicious odors of popcorn and boiling candy, of cake and mincemeat in the making, floated up from the kitchen. Such rustling of tissue paper and a scent of sachets as met one on the opening of bureau drawers. And such rapt moments of gift making, when Libby sewed with patient, learning fingers, and Willam pasted paper chains and wove paper baskets, as he had been taught in kindergarten. One day the conductor's punch suddenly reappeared, and he seized it with a whoop of joy. Now all his creations could be doubly beautiful, since they could be star-bordered. As he punched and the tiny stars fell in a shower, the story of Ina and the swans stirred in his memory, with all the glamour it had worn when he first heard it over his dish of strawberries. Down in his secret soul he determined to do what he wished he had done a year earlier, to begin to follow the example of Ina. The family could not fail to notice the almost angelic behavior which began that day. They thought it was because of the watching eye he feared up the chimney, but no one referred to the change. He used to sit in front of the fire sometimes, just as he had done at the Junction, rocking and singing, his soft bobbed hair flapping over his ears every time the rockers tilted forward. But he was not singing with any thought that he might be overheard and written down as a good little boy. He was singing just because the story of the camels and the star was so very sweet, and the mere thought of angels and silver bells and the glittering sky road brought a tingling joy. But more than all, he was singing because he had begun to weave the big beautiful mantle whose name is love. And the curious little left out in the cold feeling was gone. Christmas Eve came at last. When the twilight was just beginning to fall, Libby brought down the stockings which were to be hung on each side of the sitting room fireplace. It would be nearly an hour before their father could come home and drive the nails on which they were to be hung, but they wanted everything ready for him. Willam went out to the tool chest on the screened porch to get the hammer. It took him a long time to find it. Libby waited impatiently a few moments, supposing he had stopped to taste something in the kitchen. She was about to run out and warn him not to nip the edges from some tempting bit of pastry, as he had been known to do, but remembering how very hard he had been trying to be good all week, she decided he could be trusted. With the stockings thrown over one arm, she stood in front of the piano, idly striking the keys while she waited. She had learned to play several tunes during the year, and now that she was 8 years old, she was going to have real lessons after the holidays and learn to read music. How much she had learned since the first time her little fingers were guided over the keys. She struck those earliest learned notes again. 3 blind mice, see how they run. She could play the whole thing now, faster than flying. She ran down the keys over and over again. Then for about the 20th time, they all took after the farmer's wife, she stopped short, both hands lifted from the keys to listen. Her face blanched until even her lips were pale. Such a sound of awful battling was coming from the backyard. Recognizing Willam's voice, she ran out through the kitchen to the yard. "It's that everlasting Benjy again," called the cook as Libby darted out the door to rescue Willam from she knew not what. But it was Benjy who needed rescuing this time. Willam sat on top, so mighty in his wrath and fury that he loomed up fearsomely to the bigger boy beneath him, whose body he bestrode, and whose face he was battering with hard and relentless little fists. Both boys were blubbering and crying, but Willam was roaring between blows, "Take it back! Take it back!" Whatever it was, Benjy took it back just as Libby appeared, and being allowed to stagger up, started for the street, loudly boo-hooing at every step as he found his way homeward, for once of his own volition. The cries had startled Libby, but they were as nothing to the sight that met her eyes when she led Willam, so blinded by his own tears that he needed her guidance, to the light of the kitchen door. What she saw sent her screaming into the house with agonizing calls for mother. She still held on to Willam's hand, pulling him along after her. From forehead to chin one side of his face was scratched as if a young tiger cat had set his claws in it. A knot was swelling rapidly on his upper lip, and one hand was covered with blood. Mrs. Branfield gave a gasp as she came running in answer to Libby's calls. "Why, you poor child!" she cried, gathering him up to her and sitting down in the big rocker with him in her lap. "What happened? What's the matter?" He was sobbing so convulsively now, with long, choking gasps, that he couldn't answer. She saw that his face was only scratched, but snatched up his hand to examine the extent of its injuries. As he looked at it, too, the power of speech came back to him, in a degree. "That isn't my blood," he sobbed. "It's Benjy's blood." "Oh, Willam," moaned Libby, "on Christmas Eve, just when you've been trying so hard to be good, too." She picked up the stockings which she had dropped on running out of the house, and laid his over the back of a chair, as if she realized the hopelessness of hanging it up now, after he had acted so. At that, almost a spasm of sobs shook him. He didn't need anybody to remind him of all he had forfeited and all he had failed in. That was what he was crying about. He didn't mind the smarting of his face or the throbbing of his swollen lip. He was crying to think that the struggle of the last week was all for naught. He was all crooked with her again. She didn't want him to fight, and she'd never understand that this time he just had to. The arms that held him were pressing for an answer. "Tell me how it happened, dear." Between gulps it came. "Benjy said for me to come on, and to go to the grocery with him, and I said that my mother didn't want me to." "Yes?" encouragingly, as he choked and stopped. He had never called her that before. "And Benjy said, like he always does, that you wasn't my mother anyhow, and I said you was. If he didn't take it back, I'd beat him up." Libby was crying too now from sympathy. He'd been told so many times he must not fight that she was afraid he would have to be punished for such a bad fight as this. To be punished on Christmas Eve was just too awful. She stole an anxious glance towards the chimney, then toward her mother. But her mother was hugging him tight and kissing him wherever she could find a place on his poor little face that wasn't scratched or swollen. And she was saying in a voice that made a lump come into Libby's throat, it was so loving and tender, "My dear little boy, if that's why you fought him, I'm glad you did it. For you've proved now that you are my little son, my very own." Then she laughed, although she had tears in her eyes herself, and said, "That poor little cheek shows just what fierce nettles and briars you've been through for me. But you brought it, didn't you? The most precious starflower in all the world to me." The surprise of it stopped his tears. She understood. He could not yet stop the sobbing. That kept on doing itself. But a feeling warm and tender that he could not explain seemed to cover him from wingtip to wingtip. A bloody little hand stole up around her neck and held her tight. She was his mother, because she understood. It was all right between them now. It would always be all right, no matter what Benjy and the rest of the world might say. He'd beat up anybody that dared to say they didn't belong to each other, and she wanted him to do it. Presently she led him upstairs to put some healing lotion on his face and wash away the blood of Benjy. Libby, in the deep calm that followed the excitement of so many conflicting emotions, sat down in the big rocking chair to wait for her father. Her fear for Willam had been so strong, her relief at the happy outcome so great, that she felt all shaken up. A long, long time she sat there thinking. There was only one more thing needed to make her happiness complete, and that was to have Miss Santa Claus know that the charm had worked out true at last. She felt that they owed her that much, to let her know. Presently she slipped out of the chair and knelt in front of the fire so close that it almost singed her. "Are you listening up there?" she called softly. "'Cause if you are, please tell Miss Santa Claus that everything turned out just as she said it would. I'll be so much obliged." Then she scudded back to her chair to listen for her father's latchkey in the door, and her mother's and Willam's voices coming down the stairs, a happier sound than even the sound of the silver bells that by and by would come jingling down the Sky Road. End of chapter 7. Read to you by Lynette Geisel, December 2016. End of Miss Santa Claus of the Pullman by Annie Fellows Johnston.